back to agility, people. Many of us thought it was a plug-and-play thing. We thought, hey, well, if it works that great in teams of 6 to 9 people, homogeneous people, perfectly organized and aligned teams, well, then it must work really, really well for large organizations as well. Many people wholeheartedly disregarded the complexity that comes with roles, systems, hierarchy, and all those other things that makes the organizations messy. And true organizational agility needs an approach that takes that complexity down. Robert Briese is joining us from Sherpas GmbH in Berlin, where he works as a coach, a trainer, and consultant. And he's here to tell us how to scale an agile approach and how Scrum is a helpful tool for this. So please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the lovely introduction, Guru. Now I also understand what you meant at the beginning with this group and not feeling like a conference. It feels more like a group of friends who are touching similar points, talking about very similar things, and I can hear myself. I can hear myself in all these talks that I listened before. All right, so I think I can skip the presentation slide. You already introduced me. Just to say that I'm an agile coach and been in the software development area for quite a long time. I founded a company called Sherpas, and like the Sherpas, we're a group of coaches that try to help other companies and individuals to go up the agile mountain without doing all the work for them. We try to do the mindset thing that Karina mentioned before, and not actually teach them tools. I will reflect here on my experiences with working with big companies on how to do agile at scale. And before talking about that, I would try to define what I mean by agility. I think even presented is quite good in the different facets that there are, like the mindset that is behind the values and principles. But I will keep it short to a definition that I think it summarizes it pretty well by Bas Vode and Craig Larman in one of the first books about scaled, lean, and agile development. This book was written in 2009. There were some writings about that before, but this was like one of the most comprehensive book on that. Actually, there were like two parts. One of the organizational thinking tools, and one about the actual agile practices. And they defined their agility not as a practice, but as a quality of organization. To be adaptive, to be responsive, and be able to learn. And at extremely low costs, be able to change directions for the customer's competitive advantage. I think that pretty sums up very good the reason why it is important to do that. Sasha had a slide on that earlier today where she pretty much summarized why it's so important to do that. So as I mentioned, it has a lot of cross references with what we've seen before. I was preparing to talk about some former mobile phone companies that are not in the mobile business anymore, or in the phone business anymore, or if we look at the social network applications, I don't know about you, but for me it looks that they are getting extremely similar. We see a lot of features that now we have in all of this app. Snapchat introduced this story functionality where you can put a couple of pictures together and post them for a limited amount of time. And a couple of years later, Instagram did the same, and now you have it in Facebook and even in the Facebook Messenger and in WhatsApp and so on. So it shows that that there is the companies are extremely looking on how to make sure that they don't lose the company and what they need to do next in order to do that. As Guru mentioned before, when you're one team development and basically if you're a startup and your whole company is a team, then it's extremely easy to first of all have focus on the customer and also pay attention, measure how your product is used. So be close to your customer, and also use things like Scrum, XP to continuously learn and evolve and use agile practices. Once you get bigger than one team, then it gets pretty messy. Marty Keegan described a process that he sees many times at companies, where based on the ideas that are generated from the discussions with customers, this needs to be somehow integrated into a roadmap, just for the purpose of prioritizing things and also understanding when things will be delivered for communication and so on. So prior to that, the business case is created, and afterwards, the most important items get then created as requirements. And only afterwards, sometimes there, sometimes even at a later point, the agile thing starts. You have first the UX design and UI design, sometimes even there, and then the team starts to build in sprints and iterations, in small iterations, until they have something that they can present. This is tested ideally already during the build, but sometimes afterwards, and then deployed to the customers. And the sad part about all this is that many companies that are working like that are saying, well, we are agile. We do Scrum. That's the, and you show it like this, and you completely see the waterfall steps. So what happens most of the times is that you have a big separation on the different things that you work. When I was working for Adidas, they were working with like 12 teams on their web shop, adidas.com. And interestingly, every single team saw their feature as a separate product. So there was a product detail page product, there was a checkout product, there was a search product within the adidas.com site. There was absolutely no whole product focus. So there is not even a chance to get a whole feedback from customers on the whole product if the teams themselves just look at some specific functionality that they do. And other things that I like to call scaled-induced impediments, once you are not able to deliver what you're doing with one team and start doing it with multiple teams, you introduce portfolio management for the prioritization. You have to take care somehow of the synchronization between the teams. So you do project and program management. And we heard it before, many agile practices are introduced that support role distinction and over-specialization. You get bonus when you have you are more specialized in your field. People trying to improve their single specialization instead of growing the skills that are needed based on what the customer actually wants, or what you need to know in order to develop what the customer needs. And of course, you have geographical distribution, but still, like, one of the biggest problems is this integration and continuously integrating the different work that the teams are doing into one product. So my major point of this talk is how to do more with less. Basically, that if we want to, like, what happens with the creation of additional roles is we lose the responsibility of the teams. If we create more artifacts, we create a greater distance between teams and customers, and handovers of requirements, documents, and so on. By creating more processes, this leads to less learning and owning of the processes of the teams. So what we actually want is to do the opposite, to have less roles in order to create more responsibility, to have less artifacts in order to directly communicate with the customers and with each other, and also to have less processes, less defined processes, to have more shared responsibility and ownership of the process of the teams. Because again, what happens is whenever a problem comes up, the first thing the management does, or whoever thinks about a solution, is oh, like, we have too many defects, or let's get a QA lead. Or we need to do more, we have technical depth, we need more refactoring. Let's create a process for that. Let's create documentation on what refactoring actually means. And those things are the things that I mentioned before are reducing the whole team responsibility. So what can we do to get rid of these things, which is again a summary of the organizational design patterns that I encourage you to see in your organizations if you can live without, in order to basically enhance the team ownership and create even better products. So get rid of separation of teams for analysts and architects. That's something that I think it's already happening a lot by grouping teams together out of multiple schemes, so the so-called cross-functional teams. But also even the head of QA, UX, and architecture, I think that's a very critical topic. If you actually read the book that I recommended from Marty Keegan, he actually suggests this as a solution to make sure that you have an alignment. But I experience ways of doing alignment and still having responsibilities without having a head of UX or QA or architecture. And I will talk about that in a moment. And again, getting rid of team product owners that are at the team level in charge of the product backlog that they see, which is not really a product backlog, is a team backlog or a team output delivery list, but not actually has not the whole product focus. Yeah. So I would encourage to get rid of that, and also get rid of something that is done a lot in many companies with things like Scrum of Scrum, where Scrum Masters are helping the coordination between teams. Which doesn't say that it's good from regular time to have coordination discussions between meetings, but especially having one dedicated person, the Scrum Master, who mostly doesn't know that much about the product, doing the coordination is one of the baddest, like worst thing that you can do. And also trying to get, and that's the thing was one of the main points from the presentation before, getting the domain knowledge and the customer interaction with every single team member is extremely critical. So what you can do instead is, number one, and I think that's something that is understood already, and I see this more and more happening in most of the organization, is really create this cross-functional and also cross-component teams. The goal is here really to have teams that not only self-manage their work, but can also deliver an end-to-end feature to a customer. So they have real need of interaction with the customers on how something should work on look like. To my point before about team product owners, from my perspective, there is a need of one product owner and one product backlog in order to make this prioritization on what are the items that the teams are working on, even there are multiple teams. And at some point, this becomes not manageable by one product owner. Instead, in case of doing the facilitation of the discussions between the customer stakeholders and the team, which is the actually main job of a product owner, instead of how it's often understood, wrongly understood, of writing down the requirements, which really doesn't make sense. We want this to happen in a conversation between the customers and the team. So someone who is in charge of the prioritization is normally the best thing that you want to have. And then have the team responsible for managing their own relationship with other teams and with external people is extremely important. So handing the responsibility to take care of resolved dependencies on their own, and not some other people, Scrum Masters or special dedicated roles that take care of the coordination. And as mentioned before, and again we heard that, getting rid of specialized roles and processes as much as possible. Some other non-organizational suggestions. In order to have good alignment, create iterations that have the same time length, and from regular times to create a potential shippable product increment that is built up from the work that all the teams are doing together, and review it together as one product and not as single parts of the system that work independently, but will not work as one together. So don't try to do this work independently and at the end put this together, but have this this iteration all the time, and the product integration happening all the time. And ideally not at the end of the iterations, but continuously. So doing continuously integration is something that has been written about for a long amount of time, but it's still not really understood. For some, it's still having a continuous integration server where I put my code and then something happened and there's a department responsible for integrating the code, and not as a mindset of developing differently, writing code differently and continuously integrating it so that no matter what I'm writing on, I can continuously integrate this code, and it always works. So those are engineering practices that are extremely important if you do large-scale development, because otherwise, again, you have the problems that some teams might produce something that can work after an amount of time, but together it doesn't. And you don't want to be surprised by that after some times. And then one thing that I think is also extremely important, and even talked about leadership as being one of the main influences and actually problems. I totally agree with that. I think that's extremely important, and applying the servant leadership that we heard before, by applying things from lean thinking and to the production systems, go see, or having managers as teachers, we can help the teams develop better products, and also help them changing their mindset. All right, so now I'm gonna go to 2 examples of large-scale agile implementations that I've been involved with. The one is at SAP. I've worked there with 7 teams that were involved with one of the biggest store on their system, Hybris, for web commerce, where they sell all their products, basically, that can be sold directly to the customers. So they are not so big. So we worked here with 7 teams on multiple locations. And what we did is trying to apply Scrum with multiple teams. Not like multiple teams doing Scrum, but then having something that doesn't look as Scrum anymore, but actually really doing Scrum at scale. So again, we lived with 1 product backlog and 1 product owner. At the beginning, it was hard, because it was a huge organization with maybe even more people on the business side than on the development side. Of course, if you do sales and stuff like this, it's normal, but sometimes it's also quite concerning. Then if you have a big organization on the business side, then you usually have also a lot of managers. So they need to somehow agree to how to prioritize this list. But by making 1 product backlog, we force them to prioritize everything together in 1 order. Because the first thing normally happen is everything is very important. That's why prioritization, I try to get rid of this word and only using ordering. And with some times, they realized that basically the advantage of having 1 person in charge of this decision and doing the prioritization or the ordering. And then, like Scrum, we for all at the beginning 3, at the end 7 teams, we had a shared planning meeting, sprint planning meeting, which was at the beginning with all teams together. And after some times, when we had 7 teams, we did it with team representatives. And just the first part, were to understand which team will want to pick which items to work on. And then the teams went on and did their own planning. Sometimes even together, when there was a very cross relationship between what 2 teams were doing. And then, as in Scrum, there were daily Scrum meetings, and we had sprint review after the end of the iteration. The iteration started with 4 weeks, and we managed to get down to only 2 weeks, which, of course, was a great success in order to get faster feedback on what we're doing. And then we had team retrospectives to discuss how to improve, what we can do better, and an overall retrospective for all the teams together. That was done with, again, team representatives. And as you can see here, we basically had only 3 different roles. Yeah. There was a product owner, there was a Scrum Master for every team, and everyone else was a developer. I mentioned before that there are ways of how to make sure that if you design things or implement different techniques for testing, that you can be aligned on that without a head of QA or a head of UX. One of the things that we found out to work really good is communities or communities of practice that regularly met and shared with each other how they work. And based on what we heard before with consensus versus consent, is that once you establish a culture where people rely on each other and where people trust each other, have respect to each other, then it's quite easy to achieve consent. Maybe not consensus, that everyone is the same side, but consent, the fact that no one has something against it, is quite easy to achieve that. And that's how many decisions could be then derived by these communities, like architecture and design communities. I have one more project, which is even bigger than that, is the project that I'm working right now with at BMW about our autonomous driving platform. Here we're doing something extremely similar. So it's the same concept of trying to do Scrum at scale, but instead of 7 teams, we have over 30. And we actually are planning on adding at least the same amount of teams again. So it's a huge endeavor, and still we're working with 1 product backlog and 1 product owner. What we have now is customer-centric areas. And we have area product owners who are helping in taking care of what I said before, this connection between the ones who have the requirements, the customers or the stakeholders, and the teams. And try to facilitate this kind of discussions. Yeah. But still, we have the same flow. We have 1 planning meeting. We have the usual daily Scrum meetings and 1 sprint review meeting for each area. And from time to time, we do a sprint review together, a shared sprint review meeting. This is something that you can imagine like a bazaar, where in different areas of a huge room, the teams are presenting things that they do. But for us, the main review is actually experience the product. And there's no better way of experience the autonomous drive than to sit in the car. And that's actually what really happens. Every 2 weeks, our main sponsor experiences the latest product increment in the car. Yeah, and we have these overall retrospectives that help us improve the process, the way we work, and many communities which again, we have to take care of, and also can become a challenge. Yeah. So I'm very curious to hear your questions, and thank you for your time.
Any questions, feedback for Robert?
So I like your idea of sort of reducing the number of roles and integrating. But when I hear someone say that everybody needs to participate in all the different communication with the clients, that needs to be available basically for each sprint, at least whenever we are in doubt of something. I'm just thinking that's never going to happen. I mean, there's something here that is a little bit, you know, we have multiple teams in different countries. They cannot all join around the same wall with yellow stickers on. I mean, there must be something we can write down and communicate asynchronously somehow. And if that's the case, what is that? Is that requirements or just meeting plans for the next week?
Good question. So I think, as you said, it's impossible to be everywhere at the same time, and sometimes some feedback that we hear is also it's totally inefficient. Well, just to cover that, we heard it before. It's not definitely not the most efficient way of working, but we believe that it's the one that produces the best outcome, not the best output. But still, of course, we are trying. Time is limited, and we're looking at how to use it effectively. At the end, we encourage this everyone to understand the mindset and to make the decision themselves when something should be documented. And there are, like as the Agile value says, documentation is not bad, yeah, but working software is much more important. So we encourage to do the documentation, but ideally we document in the code, and we have create the best understanding through conversations. If there is something that we need to document just to remember what we discussed, we do that. And there are a lot of things that we still document, but not in the way that we worked before.
So obviously, when we can do the demos after each sprint, and we can involve the end user, that's a much better approach. And if it's relatively sort of understandable features or capabilities that we're developing, then that is fine. We don't need to write a lot of stuff down. Also, I agree with you that the idea of communication and learning people the requirements from the customer side or the view of the customer is important for the whole team. But we have, it's not as big as your project. We have 3 teams in 2 countries. But we have people sitting there that basically falls asleep when the user starts talking about what their requirements is. They are C# programmers. That's what they live for. And when you involve them in larger meetings and talk to the end users, they have all sorts of other plans. And then we can say, okay, that's what the manager is all about. Sit down, shut up, look up there at the stage and listen to what the client said. But there is in Agile, there is sort of this inherent problem that we all need to be there all the time and agree to everything. And the shorter the sprints become, the fewer hours is left for actually development.
Yeah, again, I mean, there's something that we hear a lot of time. I don't think that everyone needs to be there all the time. So as I mentioned, to some extent, like the planning meeting, the overall retrospectives is something that we encourage team to do with different representatives. So they have, they should engaged and decide within each other who represents the team in some of the meetings. But we also want them to make them understand that just by sitting and programming C# the whole day, programming something that is not needed for the customers, it doesn't bring any value at all. So sometimes there is a way to struggle. That we struggle, of course, in facilitating these discussions and make them interesting. But I think it's worth it. It's really important because at the end, yeah, they like to create products, but a really nice product is something that the user enjoy working with, and that's why what we try to make them understand. And if the communication is good, then that works. Yeah.
Any other comments?
I'm wondering about all the teams that you have in this loop, and if you're even adding a double amount of teams, what are the teams sort of place where they belong? Do they belong to a feature or an area or a capability? I mean, where do they reside, so to say? Or are they moved all over the place, depending on what needs you have?
No, so in the picture I showed before, again, we have this split by areas, and we try not to have more than 8 teams in one area.
And what would an area be? Would that be like logistics or sales or?
It is something that is really customer centric and brings customer value. So for us, we know that we might have people who are interested in the parking, the automated parking feature or functionality, the urban driving, and the highway driving, which are customer-centric functionality that works end-to-end, and each team there needs to know all this roles that they have to do in order to create end-to-end features.
Okay.
Yeah.
So to continue on that, is that a similar situation as in the Adidas case you described in the beginning, where the team was organized by function?
Yeah, but there was no alignment basically. So there was not one product backlog. There was not one product owner. And the biggest issue with there, I mean, even if you have these teams that are working on some feature that is used by customer end to end, and you might be able to get feedback. The biggest problem here is with local optimization. So what this leads to is that suddenly the search is becoming better and better, but the homepage doesn't. And people go away because the homepage is really bad. And it doesn't help that the search is more and more better. Yeah? So each team then was influenced by creating their own product backlog, what they are prioritizing, what they're working on, instead of focusing on the whole product. And that was the main difference, I guess, between the scenarios.
Thank you.
And thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Yes, applause. Come on, guys.